Sorry about that, folks. My video got cut off. We're going to continue with this article. I just finished reading the Donald Trump quote. We're reading Democracy Now! This article. The Donald Trump quote said, you got to take out their families quote. Then Juan Gonzalez says, your response to that, and also to the news reports that have been surfacing, that Trump is paying far less attention to these actual strikes than President Obama did, who had a much more hands-on approach to being sure he vetted every strike. Samuel Oakford. Yeah, I mean, the audio clip is, I'm sure, horrifies a lot of people. It would violate international law. If you're purposefully going after civilians, I'm sure it would horrify a lot of people in the U.S. military also. I guess if you fast forward to once Trump is now president, in late January he issues this memorandum that calls for, within 30 days, a plan to take on ISIS. He promises throughout his campaign, it's not clear exactly, what that would entail. But in the request, he asks the military to consider drawing back limits to their civilian casualty policy. He said, in essence, if you're doing anything above the level of what international law asks, why don't you maybe not do that? And that's an extremely worrying sign. And if you put together all the signs right now, the strike on a mosque, or the U.S. says they didn't know it was a mosque, which in some ways is more troubling, you look at the increasing civilian casualty in Iraq and Syria, in Raqqa and Mosul. And then you look at even in Yemen, where there's been like a rash of strikes there. That's a picture that's evolving, and you can imagine that he might have played a role, this request. Amy Goodman. Finally, the issue of the changing jurisdiction, who approves, signs off on kill lists, Donald Trump signaling, though this didn't get a lot of attention, that the CIA could do it on their own, that the Pentagon, that he wouldn't personally have to be on top of this. How does this affect the reporting you're doing? Samuel Oakford. Well, our reporting primarily has to do with the coalition. So there's been a CIA strike recently that the global #2 for Al-Qaeda was killed in Syria. But the vast majority of these civilian casualties are coming from this military campaign in Raqqa and Mosul. And one of the ways that this could manifest itself is that lower level commanders could approve things that could be kind of the gradient moves, where they can approve operations where there might be more civilians. And you can look at targeted killings and things like that, but the real number right now are coming from just airstrikes, artillery, things like that in those areas. Amy Goodman. I want to thank Samuel Oakford for telling us the war and peace. All right, so we see, Barack Obama, a terrible person, but who created this, who helped to expand this kill state, this murder inc. of outside of the United States, serving the war machine, and then, Barack Obama killed a lot of people. Arguably the biggest warmonger in U.S. history, but, he also, he handed the kill state to an accelerationist like Trump, who, campaigned on killing people and got elected because a lot of people who liked him, they don't understand it, I mean, most of them love war, but many of them, they're not very bright and don't really understand how the kind of wars we're fighting, these illegal wars, create terrorism. So the very thing that you claim to be stopping, you're creating, making you fucked up in the head, I guess. We're going to look at Mint Press News. We're going to look at NATO's war on resources is causing a humanitarian crisis in West Africa. This is from Eric Draster of Mint Press News. As millions suffer from hunger, disease, illiteracy, and grinding poverty in the Lake Chad region of West Africa, a sinister game of resource extraction and exploitation is playing out, with geopolitics at the heart of it all. Just expand this. In late February 2017, Norway hosted an international humanitarian conference on Nigeria and the Lake Chad region in hopes of attracting major donors to fund relief work. As Norway's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Borge Brende, explained, quote, "The conference has three aims: to raise awareness about the crisis, to gain more support for humanitarian efforts, and to secure greater political commitment to improve the situation." Brende's concern for the region may be laudable, but no serious examination of the crisis in West Africa can ignore the political and strategic calculus that surrounds the region. As with all conflicts in Africa, questions about resource extraction and neo-colonial exploitation abound, with corrupt governments in the region and their backers in wealthy countries, the United States, making the discussion all the more uncomfortable for the most privileged members of global society. A real discussion of the issue would highlight the questionable connections between regional governments and all the development of Boko Haram, the Nigerian terror group that is responsible for much of the havoc being wreaked in the region. It would note the vast energy deposits beneath Lake Chad that evoke an almost Pavlovian response from the leaders of surrounding countries, blinded by the dollar signs in their eyes. It would point out the moves the former colonial powers in Europe are making within the region to enrich themselves and expand their military presence, as well as increase their influence and political power. In short, the humanitarian crisis around Lake Chad is a symptom of a much larger sickness afflicting the region. We must diagnose the illness in order to treat it, not simply observe its side effects and call for more drugs. Okay, so the shadowy networks behind Boko Haram. Some of the statistics on the humanitarian situation around Lake Chad are truly appalling. According to the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, there are at least 2.1 million internally displaced people in the region, as well as 7.1 suffering from hunger, 7.1 million. 1 in every 2 families need life-saving assistance, according to aid workers. Countless thousands have been killed, injured, or otherwise terrorized by Boko Haram and other terror groups. The situation is dire. So when the UN announced that the conference had raised $672 million to help the people of the region, the news was obviously welcome. With such funds come very serious questions about how the funds will be distributed and who should be responsible for overseeing the distribution process. But determining the real causes of the crisis is perhaps the real million-dollar question. First and foremost is the question of Boko Haram, its murky origins in Nigerian political conflicts and the ramifications of its actions in the region. While definitive knowledge of the group's sponsorship remains elusive, there is ample circumstantial evidence to suggest that the elements within Nigeria's government and potentially other regional governments have been sponsoring the group from its infancy. Renowned hostage negotiator and Boko Haram intermediary, Dr. Stephen Davis, has gone on record as saying that high-ranking elements within the administration of former Nigerian President Goodluck Jonathan were involved, including Ali Modu Sharif, the former governor of Nigeria's Borno State, the heart of the Boko Haram insurgency, and one of the country's top military commanders. The Jonathan administration and Nigeria's military in turn have accused Chad's government, led by the president Idris Deby, of fueling the unrest for geopolitical and strategic regions. According to these sources, Deby facilitated the rise of Boko Haram in order to destabilize Nigeria and take advantage of growing energy extraction from the Lake Chad Basin. While the claim was certainly convenient for a Nigerian government that then was fending off accusations of its own collusion with Boko Haram, it does substantiate a 2011 intelligence memo from field officers in Chad, which noted that quote, members of Boko Haram sect are sometimes kept in the Abeche region in Chad and trained before being dispersed. This happens usually when Mr. Sharif visits Abeche. Though the details remain murky and may never be fully publicized, even a conservative assessment would note that the domestic policies of Nigeria, as well as regional political infighting facilitated by the emergence of Boko Haram. Indeed, as former President Jonathan's own presidential panel investigating Boko Haram noted, quote, the report traced the origin of private militias in Borno State, in particular of which Boko Haram is an offshoot, to politicians who set them up in the run-up to the 2003 general elections. The militias were allegedly armed and used extensively as political thugs. After the election and having achieved their primary purpose, the politicians left the militias to their fate since they could not continue funding and keeping them employed. With no visible means of sustenance, some of the militias gravitated toward religious extremism in the type offered by Muhammad Yusuf, leader of Boko Haram. From its origins as a collection of gangs used to intimidate people and influence elections to its larger development as a cohesive terror organization, Boko Haram has been of the driving force of the humanitarian crisis in the region. Of course, Boko Haram's rise would have been impossible without the criminal US-NATO war on Libya, which not only toppled the Libyan government, but also led to a tsunami of weapons flowing out of Libya and into the hands of regional terror groups such as Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb and the nascent Boko Haram. In a very direct way, the US-NATO war birthed the violent conflict we see today in the region. And we go to a humanitarian crisis and a resource war. Sadly, most humanitarian crises in the world stem from politics and greed. The human tragedy unfolding in the Lake Chad region is no different. At the heart of the issue is oil. In recent years, oil discoveries throughout the Lake Chad basin have transformed how the states of West Africa view their economic future. At the heart of the basin is Lake Chad, surrounded by the countries of Nigeria, Chad, Cameroon, and Niger. According to a 2010 assessment from the U.S. Geological Survey, the Chad Basin has, quote, estimated mean volumes of 2.32 billion barrels of oil, 14.65 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and 391 million barrels of natural gas liquids. The potential size of these resources has likely attracted the attention of political and business leaders both in the region and internationally. They're really burying the fucking lead in this story here. Get to the NATO puppets. Yes, the governments of Nigeria are bad, but they're, you know, these countries that don't have the wealth and the ability of the countries, U.S. and NATO countries, you know, they're the ones toppling these democracies and setting up terror groups to go to polling places, scare the shit out of people so they keep their fucking puppets in power. But, you know, he's getting there. Let's continue. All the countries surrounding the basin have expressed strong desire in recent years to begin exploiting the energy reserves there. However, until only very recently, Nigeria has been unable to do so due to the Boko Haram insurgency. EMP, Exploration and Production, publication issued by Hard Energy noted in March 2014, quote, Hopes of stepping up oil exploration in Nigeria's Lake Chad Basin have been dashed by the brutal attacks of Islamic Boko Haram and the Ansuru sect terrorists in the country's northeastern region. Between 2011 and 2013, the Nigerian government provided $240 million to facilitate oil and gas exploration activities in Lake Chad Basin. Fascist propaganda coming out of an oil mouthpiece, blaming any of the violence in Africa or the Middle East, anywhere in the world, as Islamic. No. Those are called puppet Westerners who are just trying to exploit resources and people, not Islam or whatever racist bullshit they can come up with, along with their corporate propaganda. But Minpress continues. So while Nigeria was forced to put the brakes on its oil exploration and development in the Chad Basin, its neighbors, particularly Chad, continued theirs. Nigeria had jump-started its exploration activities in Lake Chad just in the last few months, presumably thanks to progress that has been made in the fight against Boko Haram. As Dr. Peregrino Bruma explained in 2014, quote, "The Boko Haram insurgency has conveniently provided Chad, under the government of Idris Deby, unfettered access to the oil under Nigeria's soil through 3D oil drilling from within its territorial borders, which the country exports. It seems that Deby has engaged in siphoning off Nigeria's oil wealth and exporting it for massive profits for himself and his cronies." Of course, Chad is not alone in this endeavor, as it has a company from Cameroon and Niger, both of whom are doing precisely the same thing. The regional dynamic is key here, as fighting has spilled over the borders into the neighboring Cameroon and Niger on numerous occasions. This is precisely the pretext that the U.S. and its European partners are using to become further involved in military in the region. Like, this is the next place, folks. This is the next Iraq. These poor African countries. This is Libya, Somalia. We've been at war in Africa for years and years and years now. We've been doing this. It's like clockwork to us. So, this is the next place we're gonna be destroying. So Lake Chad and France's neo-colonial agenda in West Africa. And again, it's not just the U.S. And again, of course, the governments of Chad and Nigeria are to blame for a lot of this, the corruption in those governments as well. But countries like France and countries like the U.S., these are the people with the ability. These people, the United States and France can end all these crises tomorrow with our wealth and our power. But let's continue. For the last 500 years, colonial powers have dominated the political and economic life of Africa. But while formal colonialism may have ended decades ago, the informal dominance and control of Africa continues. This neo-colonial control of the continent and its resources is at the root of all conflicts in Africa, including the current crisis in Lake Chad. Francophone West Africa includes Cameroon, Niger, and Chad. This makes France, which continues to be the main trading partner for these countries, into a dominant player in the scramble for Lake Chad. The 2012 coup in Mali and the civil war that subsequently ensued gave the French military the opening it needed to permanently station military forces throughout the region. The ongoing Operation Barkhane has at least 3,000 French troops spread across the Sahel region, including in Niger and Chad. However, the real question is not whether or not France is right in coming to the defense of its former colonies, but what its real agenda actually is. Despite its rhetoric of maintaining democracy, stability, and the rule of law, France has very self-interested motives. With regard to Boko Haram, Nigeria, and the Lake Chad Basin, France is the primary beneficiary of the energy extraction taking place there. At its port of Le Havre is the final destination for the unrefined oil. Taken in terms of both actual and potential exports, the area's vast energy reserves are worth billions. But France's economic interest in the region does not stop with the energy. France has been a keen interest in exploiting lucrative mineral deposits throughout the area, as is evidenced by the fact that the government of French President François Hollande is investing more than $500 million in a new state-owned mining company. As French Industry Minister Arnaud Montebourg stated while announcing the creation of the new venture, quote, Francophone Africa countries, notably, would like to work with us rather than do business with foreign multinationals. Naturally, one should take such a statement with a healthy dose of skepticism as to just how much choice those countries, let alone their citizens, will have in the matter. Not only will France be looking to exploit mineral deposits of lithium and germanium, but also rare earth metals that have become highly lucrative due to the significant demand for the metals in the tech manufacturing industry. Moreover, Montebourg's use of the phrase foreign multinationals is quite revealing. For one thing, it seems that the French political and business elite do not consider themselves to be foreign when operating in Francophone countries. The neocolonialism of such a mentality is impossible to ignore. Secondly, it seems almost self-evident that the foreign multinationals to which he is referring are Chinese companies, both private and state-owned, that have made tremendous inroads through the region in terms of mineral extraction and investment. France is clearly cognizant of a possible turf war between themselves and China over West Africa's resources. Oh, craziness in this world. There are vast deposits of uranium throughout the region that have piqued France's interests. As Think Africa Press reported in 2014, quote, France currently sources over 75% of its electricity from nuclear energy and is independent on Niger for much of its immediate and future uranium supply. This dependence could grow even further when the production at the recently discovered Imoraren uranium deposit is up and running in 2015. The mine is set to produce 5,000 tons of uranium per year and would help make Niger the second largest uranium producer in the world. Areva, which is 87% owned by the French state and holds a majority share in three out of the 4 uranium mining companies operating in Niger, is funding the new mine. Add to the fact that Nigerian President Mahamadou Issoufou is a former employee of Areva, a company that still maintains a near monopoly over the uranium trade. It would come as no surprise that the main competition for Areva and France for this lucrative trade is China, which, quote, already owns a 37% stake in Niger's Somina mine and has carried out uranium exploration throughout the country. The battle between France and China for control of strategic resources and markets is becoming an increasingly critical part of France's overall policy in the region. France's goal is to reestablish economic hegemony in its Francophone sphere of influence, as is evidenced by the French government's policy paper, quote, A Partnership for the Future, 15 Proposals for a New Economic Dynamic between Africa and France, which could be seen as a blueprint for French policy in the area. This increased emphasis is likely due to the fact that, quote, over the past decade, France's share of African trade plummeted from 10 to 4.7%, while China's African market share soared to over 16% in 2011. The contours of this proxy war are unmistakably apparent. Pretty long article, but interesting stuff. Let's keep going. The growing U.S. military footprint. Companies in France, the U.S. is waging Compared to France, the U.S. is waging an even greater political and strategic proxy war with China over Africa's resources. While China's influence on the continent has grown by leaps and bounds, Western countries, especially the U.S., have been left scrambling to shore up their hegemony over the continent. The U.S. has chosen to meet Chinese economic penetration with military occupation, both overtly and covertly. The U.S. has established a vast network of drone bases in the region, though the military office officials refuse to describe the facilities as anything more than temporary staging areas. But a simple look at the map above, combined with disparate reports in multiple media outlets, paints a much more insidious picture of what the U.S. is doing. Under the auspices of AFRICOM, the U.S. operates in nearly every significant country on the continent. In Chad, which figures prominently in the Boko Haram narrative, the U.S. has indefinitely stationed military personnel ostensibly to search for Nigerian schoolgirls who were kidnapped by Boko Haram. However, the White House's own press statement reveals a much more far-reaching objective. Quote, these personnel will support the operation of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance aircraft for missions over northern Nigeria and the surrounding area. Translation, the U.S. has drones and other surveillance covering the entire Lake Chad Basin. While the U.S. only acknowledged sending a small contingent of soldiers, the reality is that far more U.S. forces are engaging in Chad in one form or another. This is perhaps best illustrated by the not-so-coincidental fact that Chad played host to AFRICOM's Flintlock 2015 military exercises, which took place on February 16, 2015, in the capital of N'Djamena, with outstations in Nigeria, Cameroon, Tunisia, and will run through March 9th, 2015. To summarize, U.S. military personnel led exercises all throughout the region with specific attention to Lake Chad Basin countries. But it certainly doesn't stop there. The U.S. now operates 2 critical drone bases in the region, with one base in Cameroon's city of Garo and another in the Nigerian city of Agadez. As The Intercept reported, quote, the top MILCON military construction project for US AFRICOM, okay, is located in Agadez, Niger, to the construct of a C-17 and MQ-9 capable airfield, reads a 2015 planning document. RPA presence in Northwest Africa supports operations against 7 Department of State designated foreign terrorist organizations. Moving operations to Agadez aligns persistent ISR to current and emerging threats over Niger and Chad, supports French regionalization, and extends range to cover Libya and Nigeria. The strategic value of such bases is perfectly clear. As the Washington Post noted, quote, the Predator drones in Niger give the Pentagon the strategic foothold in West Africa. Niger also borders Libya and Nigeria, which are also struggling to contain armed extremist movements. Nigerian President Issoufou Mahamadou said this government invited Washington to send surveillance drones because he was worried that the country might not be able to defend its borders from Islamic fighters based in Mali, Libya, or Nigeria. We welcome the drones, Mahamadou said. Our countries are like the blind leading the blind, he said. We rely on countries like France and the United States. We need cooperation to ensure our security. And here the connection between the U.S. military engagement and Boko Haram becomes painfully clear. The U.S. cynically exploits the instability in the region, a direct outgrowth of the U.S.-NATO war against Libya, to further entrench its military. We go on to U.S. military empire expands elsewhere in Africa. Last part here. Recent years have seen other countries in sub-Saharan Africa struggling with terrorism and in desperate need of, quote, assistance from the U.S. While some might recall that January 2016 attack on a luxury hotel in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso's capital, few know that the U.S. Uses the country as a key node in its aerial surveillance and military intelligence network in Africa. As the Washington Post reported in 2012, quote, a key hub of the U.S. spying network can be found in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, under a classified surveillance program codenamed Creek Sand. Dozens of U.S. personnel and contractors have come to the capital of Burkina Faso in recent years to establish a small airbase on the military side of the international airport. The unarmed U.S. spy planes fly hundreds of miles north to Mali, Mauritania, and the Sahara. Of course, these examples only scratch the surface of the vast military and surveillance architecture constructed by the U.S. in Africa over the last decade or so. With China becoming an increasingly dominant economic force on the continent, the U.S., France, and other powers have moved to consolidate their control over both the resources and the politics of Africa through militarization. The crisis in Lake Chad is one of the sad results of these efforts. It would be incorrect to say that the crisis in Lake Chad is entirely solely attributable to imperialist intrigue. It must be said that the climate change is also playing a huge role. As Lake Chad, once the largest reservoir in the Sahel region of Africa, has lost roughly 80% of its total area. The loss of portions of lake has had a direct negative effect on people's livelihoods and access to water. This has had the effect of driving desperate young men into the arms of Boko Haram and other criminal groups. Through the circumstances Though the circumstances may be complex, the Lake Chad crisis cannot be fundamentally resolved without addressing the political and geopolitical questions at the heart of it all. There is a certain dialectical irony in the fact that climate change helps fuel the loss of Lake Chad, which, at the very same moment, is being exploited for its oil wealth. There is an almost tragicomic quality to such a reality. Sadly, it is all too painful. It is an all too painful reality for the millions of Africans who live there every day. So, a great article from Eric Draster, Mint Press News. A good rundown of a closer look at Africa. You know, we tend to view these illegal murder wars as, you know, very directly on the murder and exploitation in the Middle Eastern nations, and you know it's Africa. And again, it's not just Middle East and Africa. You know, we're exploiting people in Latin America, Asia, Eastern Europe, everywhere, Europe, all of Europe, but. Yeah, it's a lot of good information. I mean, of course, who's to blame for all of this? You know, I feel like the article kind of buried the lead there. Of course, talk about Boko Haram and these criminal groups, but we need to remember that the Western imperialists created Boko Haram to create the situation you're seeing right there. It's completely manufactured by the West, and they're puppets in these corrupted governments of Chad and Nigeria, and you know these banana republics, as every country in the West is a banana republic as well. But you know, we look at the governments of these African countries being led by the will of the U.S. and France and NATO countries. So let's continue our continue our anti-war look. We're going to look again at Mint Press News, article by Jason Ditz. U.S. launches over 7,000 airstrikes in Iraq, Syria in past 2 months. According to statistics posted online last week by U.S. Air Force Central Command, the coalition released 3,600 weapons against ISIS in January and another 3,440 in February. With the fighting against ISIS increasingly confined to densely populated cities like Mosul and Raqqa, the U.S. air war against them continues to escalate precipitously, with record numbers of airstrikes in recent months and the coalition dropping over 7,000 munitions on Iraq and Syria in just that last 2 months. Air Force Central Command spokeswoman Captain Kathleen Atanasov attributed to the continued increase in strikes to the effort to support Iraq's invasion of Mosul, a city of well over 1 million people. With the fighting there heavily confined to residential neighborhoods, however, the heavy use of airstrikes must raise concern of large civilian tolls. January now stands as a record month for strikes in the current war, with some 3,600 U.S. and coalition strikes taking place. The number in February was roughly equaled at 3,440, with the difference attributable to there being less days in February. Captain Atanasov wasn't presenting this as a campaign at its peak, however, saying that as the military offensive on the ground moves forward, the U.S. air campaign tends to increase as the clearing of territory opens up new areas to U.S. strikes in the effort to, quote, hunt down and kill ISIS. She added that the number of strikes in Afghanistan will also increase in Afghanistan, with the weather making it easier to carry out strikes. So, good God. Yeah, I mean, that's warfare, folks. You know, it's about to be, right, that's what you said. It's about to be, the weather's going to get better in the Middle East. Less rain and whatever weather would help drone strikes, you know, aircrafts move. You know, expect much more as the seasons change. You know, it's crazy what we're doing everywhere. Let's look at Palestine. Let's look at another article. How long is this? All right, U.S. furious over another scathing UN report on Israeli abuses. Just days after a UN report accusing Israel of apartheid was pulled because of U.S. pressure, another UN agency issued a new criticism. A United Nations right expert issued a scathing report criticizing Israel's policies Monday, just a few days after the world body withdrew a report that accused Israel of apartheid against Palestinians after U.S. and Israeli pressure. In the report, Michael Link, the UN Special rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories, charged Israel with, quote, the subjugation of humanity in Palestine and intensifying a crackdown on human rights campaigners. Link made the claim in a report presented to the UN Human Rights Council during the Geneva-based body's mandated session on Israel, known as Agenda Item 7. Israel is the only country targeted with a dedicated Rights Council agenda item. He decried how Israel's, quote, illegal settlement enterprise has moved at an alarming pace since Donald Trump assumed the presidency in January, calling the practice a, quote, flagrant violation of international law. His report also pointed to how the illegal settlement built is accompanied by, quote, high rates of demolition of Palestinian homes in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Israel and its supporters, notably in Washington, have repeatedly highlighted Agenda Item 7 as evidence of the Council's credibility gap, arguing it cannot be effective while disproportionately targeting Israel. The U.S. has taken those concerns to the next level, with its top diplomat, Rex Tillerson, publicly threatening to withdraw from the council over its, quote, biased agenda item against Israel. The U.S. and Israel boycotted Monday's session that saw a group of majority Muslim nations repeatedly denounce Israel's treatment of the Palestinians. Linked scathing findings were issued days after UN official Rima Khalaf resigned over another report in which she accused Israel of being an apartheid state. Khalaf, a Jordanian national, said she had resisted a request from UN Chief Antonio Guterres to withdraw the report. She claimed that, quote, powerful member states had pressured the world body and its chief with, quote, vicious attacks and threats. The Trump administration had demanded that the report by the UN Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia be withdrawn and threatened cuts in funding to the world body. However, as part of the obligations under the Israeli agenda item, Guterres' office presented its latest findings to the Council Monday. Quote, chronic violations of international human rights and international humanitarian law by all parties have persisted. The Secretary General's office said, condemning Israel over settlement expansion among other offenses. Washington funds roughly a quarter of all UN activities, but Trump's initial budget proposal foresees significant reductions. So, we see the culprit, folks. We see the culprit in Israel and Palestine, in occupied Palestine. We see the culprit in the 8 wars in the Middle East and Africa. We see the culprit in all of these poorer nations around the world having their democracies toppled, having NATO puppets and Western puppets and U.S. puppets set up in banana republics, just like we have in the United States. You know, we see the culprit. It's not Boko Haram. It's not ISIS, because Boko Haram and ISIS are NATO. They are the United States government, people. So, you know, we have the power to create a lot of change in the United States, because this country's policies are the ones fueling these problems in the world. So massive civil disobedience, of course, on a global scale, but especially in the United States, where we have a lot of power as a citizenry to stop this from happening. We live in this country. We know where Donald Trump is. You take him out in the street, you bash his fucking head against the pavement until he's dead forever, and then you install a dictatorship of the proletariat, a dictatorship of the people, until a democratic republic can be put into place. And then once the democratic republic is put into place, an actual democratic republic, ideally on a global scale, you can install communism, because communism is what the republic, the rule by the people who know who are experts in certain fields, would tell you the best way to run an economy and a government, which is through communism. But it's if you had a democracy, it's also what people want. Little do people know that they are communist. Many people, we saw that study where people, they said they were for universal healthcare, universal education, these socialist programs. But in that same study, they also said that they're for having the resources of our world managed in a way that meets the needs of all people. Yeah, that's communism, folks, and we all are that. Especially if you're a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew or a Hindu person. A lot of these religions, especially Christianity, especially the King James Version of the Bible, is communist propaganda in many parts of it. The parts about performing acts of charity to the needy. So, I think this was a good episode. Kind of stuck entirely on foreign policy. I wanted to look at some of this John Stone stuff, but we'll get to a more domestic talk in the next episode. But yeah, I read a lot of good stuff, especially about Africa. You could really, that was a really good article. Go check out Mint Press News. We looked at Democracy Now, and we looked at, what else did we look at? I think it was just those two. But yeah, if we want to stop this from happening, it's not gonna manifest itself. And you know, the people in these poorer countries, they don't have the resources or the ability that we as a people have in the West, in these countries with, you know, if we shut down the war industry that we live around and we work in, you know, that this is how we stop them. It has to, this movement needs to happen, of course, globally, but especially in the United States. But yeah, we need to organize our people's revolution, and we need to organize our anti-war movement. Please like and share and subscribe and do whatever to this video. I'm Sandy Frank, and I will see you in the next one.